Welcome everybody. I'm Darlene McLennan, and on behalf of Attend and ADSET, I would like to welcome you all to this webinar. A huge thank you to Dr. Scott Hollier from Media Access Australia for giving his time today and sharing his experience and knowledge with us. Scott has come highly recommended from the WA disability practitioners as he gave a similar presentation to them a couple of months ago. As we are all aware, technology is always evolving and changing, and the IT people within the further education sector can change just as fast. It's important that as practitioners we stay up to date with new technologies and the law and guidelines surrounding them. Before we start, I just want to do a few housekeeping items for those who didn't join us last time. This webinar is being live captioned by Bradley Reporting and will be recorded. The recording will be placed on ADSET. We are in the process of trialling different platforms, trying to seek out the best one that meets everyone's accessibility needs. There are some downsides to the GoToWebinar platform, and we apologise for this. During trialling, we were advised that there are some accessibility issues for screen reader users. All participants have been muted, and this is to ensure as little background noise is received during the webinar. Scott will speak for around 40 minutes. Throughout the presentation, feel free to enter your questions into the question pod, and Scott will answer them at the end of the presentation. I'll also ask them of Scott, so if you can just put your questions in there or throughout the presentation. Just a reminder for participants who are screen reader users, please email Jane Hawkeswood at utas.edu.au with any questions or comments you may have during the webinar, and we will pass them on. If you have any technical difficulties, including talking like I'm having at the moment, during the webinar, please email Jane Hawkeswood at utas.edu as well. Okay, so without any further delay, it's over to you, Scott. Welcome.
That's great, and thanks so much for the opportunity to share this information today. It really is a privilege. I'm going to look at accessibility and the education experience and talk a bit about the current mainstream technologies, how students are now accessing online information and education-related materials through popular mobile and computing devices, and also look a bit about the developer side, what ICT professionals need to do to make things accessible, and how to have that conversation with ICT staff to say, look, within this learning management software or within this CMS, we need to try and make accessibility happen so that those mainstream tools work effectively. Just briefly about the organisation I represent, Media Access Australia. We're Australia's only independent not-for-profit organisation dedicated to supporting the media needs of people with disabilities. Some of the things that we look at include cinema, TV, DVD, digital online media and education, and we aim to be a catalyst for change. In terms of me personally, I am Project Manager, Major Projects for Media Access Australia. I also represent Media Access Australia on the Advisory Committee of the W3C, and this is the organisation dedicated to the creation of web standards. I've also done some research in this area looking at ways to make computers and internet more accessible to people with disabilities. And I'm also legally blind myself. I have an eye condition called retinitis pigmentosa, and in my particular case it means I have very narrow tunnel vision. I have no night vision, so in dark or dimly lit areas it's a bit tricky for me to see. And I have, it's a bit like when you look at the sun, you look away, you can get those flashing in front of your eyes. I have that all the time. And while the prognosis for my condition isn't the best, to be honest, I've been very fortunate in life. And amongst my friends, they don't have too many concerns about my disability, but they are a bit worried that I live in Perth and follow a Victorian football team that often gets me in trouble. So I'm just up to slide now titled Brief History of Access, slide 4 I think. And one of the reasons why I'm very excited about this topic is because we have come so far in a very short space of time. If I go back to my original studies in computer science at Curtin University in the 90s, I needed quite a lot of help to get access to information. If I wanted to do a computing assignment, I'd need help trying to find the library on campus. I'd need help trying to get the right books. I'd need help for those books to be converted into large print or audio. And this would take quite a lot of time. It would require quite a lot of resources and people to help me. And sometimes before that help could be arranged, even under the best of circumstances, the course had progressed somewhat and it felt like I was doing a lot of catch-up. But what's exciting today is that thanks to the internet, we can independently access information, and I can't stress the word independence enough. If I have the right colors, the right font, the screen reader or the magnifier or whatever assistive technologies I need to get access to my computing or mobile device, I can now independently access that curriculum. I can independently get to that learning management software. I can independently find out across the world what information I need to do my studies. And so it really is that independence that has made such a profound difference thanks to the web and the technologies available. So onto the slide, user experience. And it's been interesting how the provision of mainstream technology has changed things quite a lot. When I was originally doing my studies, if there was assistive technologies available, they would usually cost several $1,000s, usually more than the device itself that they were running on. And even 10 years ago, if I wanted to use a computer, it would probably have to be a Windows computer. It'd probably have to be quite a powerful Windows computer. And I'd probably need to spend $2,000 on something like JAWS or, with my limited vision, Zoom text. And what's exciting today is that whilst these tools are still around, it's been wonderful to see that built into Windows, built into a Mac, built into an iOS device like an iPad, or built into Android, are a lot of accessibility features and a lot of good quality accessibility features too. What this means for people with disabilities is that you no longer have to buy the product just for someone with a disability. You now can buy pretty much any of the major products off the market, and also you have that choice as to which one works best for you. So in terms of students, the feedback we've been receiving is that more and more students are using iPads, using cheap Android tablets, using Windows, and for a lot of students, the accessibility features they need are already built in out of the box. So what exactly are the accessibility features in a lot of these mainstream technologies? Well, if we move onto the slide titled Windows 7/8.1, and also there's some interesting things emerging in Windows 10 that's not too far away now. We have the ability to change the icon and the text size. We have the ability to adjust the mouse pointer. We have the ability to make a high contrast color scheme, and that's something that I personally use a lot. I change my windows to high contrast black, so I have, a bit like these slides, I have light color text on a dark background, and that helps me a lot. I also have things like toggle keys and the ability, if you have a mobility impairment, if you're trying to hold down the Alt key and reach over to the F, you can set it so that you can press the Alt key and then the F, and that's very helpful for people with a mobility impairment. We also have the ability to have visual alerts, so that if someone has a hearing impairment, you can get a message to pop up on the screen to explain why Windows made that strange noise. We have on-screen keyboard, which is very helpful for people with a mobility impairment. We have the magnifier, which allows you to zoom into a portion of the screen, something that I, again, personally use quite a lot. And there's also the screen reader built into Windows Narrator, which up until Windows 7 wasn't that great, to be honest, but in Windows 8 and 8.1 they did improve Narrator quite a bit, so it's now touch enabled as well as keyboard and mouse, and they did some good updates along the way. There are also some other good free options when it comes to screen readers, and one that recent WebAIM survey said is used by about 1 in 3 blind people around the world now is NVDA. And the NVDA screen reader is for Windows, it's free, can be downloaded from nvaccess.org, and was developed by 2 Australian blokes, which is a great thing. So even when there are some shortcomings, like in Windows with Narrator, it's nice that there are some still free options, like a very good quality screen reader in NVDA. Often people ask about the Mac and how viable is that for students getting access, and the answer is that the Mac has a lot of great built-in accessibility features as well, and the VoiceOver screen reader is particularly good. It's certainly a lot better than Narrator on Windows, and there is some good native Braille display support, so if you want to connect a Braille display device, that works quite well. It's got Zoom and basically all the features I mentioned earlier for Windows. The deal breaker, though, for a lot of people on the Mac side is that Office for Mac doesn't work very well with the assistive technology products. Now, this isn't a fault of Apple as such, given that Office for Mac was built by Microsoft, but because VoiceOver isn't very compatible with the current version of Office for Mac, a lot of people feel that's a deal breaker and do tend to migrate, if they want a desktop experience and a production device, migrate back to a Windows platform. The same can't be said though for iOS devices such as the iPad and the iPhone, which is extremely good with accessibility out of the box. And it's amazing to think that only for 6 years have we actually considered that a blind person can use a touchscreen. Prior to the iPhone 3GS, it was generally thought that that was impossible. And it's amazing now that we often take for granted that we have these abilities. So on iOS devices like the iPad, we have the VoiceOver screen reader, which is very effective in a touch environment. We have Zoom, high contrast or inverted color themes, the ability to push the audio all into one ear if you're hearing impaired. We have caption video playback support. And there's also some great resources out there, such as the website appleviz.org, which is really good in terms of feedback from consumers as to what apps work well and what apps don't with the assistive technology. So there's some great crowdsourcing base out there now, which is really helpful. One of the things that we've been asked a lot recently is about the Apple Watch and how accessible is that. Now, I think it's unlikely we're going to see a barrage of students suddenly wanting to access all their online learning through the Apple Watch, but it's been interesting to track its access. And what I draw encouragement for is that as a first-generation device, it does have quite a bit of accessibility. It does have the VoiceOver screen reader. It does have some magnification features. It does have that ability to push the audio into one ear, which is exciting. And you still have to have it paired with a fairly recent iPhone, but I think it's encouraging that there are some good accessibility features. Although I did put in a request to my boss to ask him if he could send me the $14,000 18-karat gold one for testing, but he didn't seem very keen on the idea for some reason. So I'm just onto the slide Android, and Google Android is one of the things that has been particularly popular among students in recent times, the main reason being that it's so affordable. On eBay, for example, you can buy a $70 7-inch Android tablet and it comes with accessibility features. So this is really exciting that whilst Apple is arguably the better of the two when you look at an Android tablet compared to an iPad, for example, the fact that an iPad's still around that $500-600 mark and you can get those sub $100 tablets on Android make Android options very appealing. So Android has the TalkBack screen reader built in. It has Magnify. It has switch key support as of Android 5. Android really came into prominence around version 4.2, known as Jelly Bean, and 4.4 KitKat was also very good. And now 5.0 Lollipop adds switch key support, better contrast themes, and also the ability to adjust things for color correction. People often ask me, why do I talk about desserts when I'm talking about Android? Google like to name their various versions after desserts, so we do have Jelly Bean, KitKat, and Lollipop. They name them in alphabetical order, so my personal tip for the next one is Marshmallow. But I think it is very exciting that, whilst Android wasn't that great for quite some time, we've seen a lot of catch-up. And, Android is now, for the most part, for everyday tasks, I think Android is a viable option now. Although I would still give the nod to the Apple mobile devices being set a little bit better and a bit more polished with accessibility. So on to the next slide titled Audio Demonstration. And what I'd like to do is just give a little demonstration of where accessibility works, where accessibility doesn't. Now what I've done is I've got my trusty Android phone with me. It runs Android 5.0 Lollipop. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put it close to my mic so you can have a listen to the TalkBack screen reader in action. I'm also going to give you a demonstration of accessibility. So you should hear.
11:15.
So that's 11:15 Perth time. It's announced the time there.
Unlocked. Home screen.
And I'm moving my finger
Button.
around the screen.
Applications.
And I'm going to take you to an app called CNET.
CNET.
Now I love
CNET.
the news, and CNET is a technical news app, and it's just loading that for me as we speak. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to move my finger around the screen, and you should be able to hear it read out some things to me.
Featured. China's Xiaomi lands in the US and Europe.
So that part of the app is quite accessible. We hear it read out the news item for me, and that's quite good. But not all of the app is accessible. If I move my finger a little higher up to this button,
Button 55, unlabeled.
you may have heard it just say button 55 unlabeled. Now, what that means is that basically the app has a button that isn't labeled properly. So even though I have great accessibility on my Android device, I have the screen reader turned on, for the most part it works quite well for me. The reality is that that app has an accessibility flaw because a developer didn't label a button. So all the assistive technology in the world on my device won't solve that problem unless the developer labels that button. To this day, to be honest, I still don't know what that button does, so I hope it's not important. But this turns our attention to the next part of this presentation, which is really about how can we support the development of accessible content in our tertiary institutions. How can we have those conversations with the ICT professionals to get them to make things accessible? And if you are an ICT professional listening today, then there's some good tips and tricks to assist you. But essentially, everything hinges around the W3 and also ISO standard, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and I'm also on the slide titled ICT Professionals at this point. The Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2, or WCAG 2 as we call it, is essentially a series of 12 guidelines designed to ensure that when websites are built, that they're built in a way that makes them accessible. And from a policy point of view, WCAG 2 has had a pretty good adoption. We've seen that it's the federal government has taken it quite seriously through a national transition strategy to get all its sites accessible, and that strategy finished at the end of last year. It's well supported by the Australian Human Rights Commission, who recommend the AA requirement of WCAG 2, and there's 3 levels of implementation, A, AA, and AAA, and they recommend that middle AAA one. And ultimately, around the world, WCAG is quite well supported. So when we think about what needs to happen to make websites accessible or to make that app accessible, the conversation really is WCAG 2. And in Australia, as I said, we have those 3 different implementation levels, A, AA, and AAA, and we aim for AA. Briefly about the difference between those levels, A, and I'm paraphrasing here, but A is basically the absolutely essential things that need to be done to make a website accessible. AA is a little bit more of the media-rich content, and AAA is more if you're building something specifically for people with disabilities. And around the world, policy and legislative frameworks tend to go up to AA. So what exactly is in WCAG 2, and what can we consider when it comes to making things accessible? Well, within WCAG 2, and I'm on the WCAG 2 at a glance slide at this point, it's broken into 4 parts: perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And amongst those 4, there's 12 key guidelines that ICT professionals need to consider to make things accessible. So the first one is the need to provide text alternatives. And this is no surprise given we just had that app which would have benefited heavily from having a text alternative on that button. Text alternatives basically ensure that visual content has some sort of text label to indicate what needs to be read out to a screen reader or with the other technologies. So it's a pretty straightforward thing to do in code, and so for an ICT professional, it's basically just a few words of text. Sometimes people ask us, well, what's a good example of a text alternative? How do I know what to write against a particular image? And our advice is that whatever you would type into a search engine to try and find an image, say in Google image search, that text is probably a good text alternative for that image. The second one is the need to provide captions, and this is absolutely imperative, and we strongly recommend that captions are provided. Captions were often seen to be a difficult thing to produce for people who are deaf and hearing impaired, but in this day and age, captions are far more straightforward to implement. Even on YouTube, you can upload a video and click on a process button, and that really helps a lot in getting things accessible. It is a bit of a disclaimer though on that, because whilst Google can automatically caption your video by clicking on that process button, the timing will probably be right, but the captions may or may not turn out great. So if it's a talking head sort of video with no background noise and someone talking with a slight American accent, the automated captions will probably turn out quite well. If it's a few teenagers flying past a camera on a skateboard and shouting something, then it's unlikely that those automated captions will turn out well. But it does help with timing, and there is a free editor built in as well, so you can sort of tweak those captions after that's done. The next thing is the need to make sure that content is presented in different ways. So this is things like if you have a map of Australia and you want people to choose the state or territory on that map, you should also have some text links to say West Australia, New South Wales, Victoria, Tasmania, and so on, just to make sure that if people do have difficulties understanding the visual representation, that there's a clear way to have that presented in a different way. There's also a need to make sure that it's easy for users to see and hear content. This relates particularly to colour contrast and making sure that people have controls when audio starts straight away. Moving on to the next slide with operable, and we need to make sure that things are accessible by keyboard. And this is essentially due to screen reader users primarily using keyboard shortcuts to get around, and also touch gestures work in a similar way on mobile devices. So we need to make sure that it's easy for people to jump from link to link, and using, say, the tab key, for example, and just checking that everything works through keyboard, that people don't get stuck. The next point is making sure that there's enough time for people to read and use content. Now, recently there was a case in the Human Rights Commission where a blind woman took calls to the Human Rights Commission saying that there were difficulties in a grocery shopping website. One of the big issues in using a site like that is that you can, it may take you longer using assistive technology to get all your items, put them in the shopping cart, and try and get to the end of the checkout process. And there's not many more things frustrating than when you go to a website to complete a specific task, you then work your way to the end of that process only to receive timeout. And a number of universities and admin processes often hinge on that time. So this is really about making sure that people have enough time, or the ability to extend their time. That still meets security concerns because you know the person's still there, but just giving people flexibility as to how long it takes to complete something. We also need to make sure the content doesn't cause seizures. So this is really about making sure that there aren't things that flash on the screen more than 3 times a second. I don't see many examples of that around education websites, so I think that one's pretty much all right. Making sure users can navigate and find content. This is really about breadcrumbs. This is about sitemaps and making it really clear how to navigate. Just moving on to the next slide now around understandable, and it's important to make sure that content is readable and understandable so that the language is quite clear in terms of explaining things. Making sure that content operates in predictable ways. This point is really about making sure that a navigation menu doesn't, say, have a secret hidden download PDFs all of a sudden, or that you pop up windows. And just making sure that if people are using assistive technology, there's nothing unusual that will happen, that the site works basically the way you would expect it to work. We also need to make sure that users can avoid and correct mistakes. This is a lot about forms on websites. So we're talking here about making sure that that a website has a well-labeled form, so that instead of saying something like date, it'll say date mm/ or dd/mm/yyyy. So very specific information to make sure that people don't make mistakes and understand what needs to go in. The other half of that is making sure that if people do make mistakes, that something comes back to them which is really clear about what mistake they made and what they need to do to address it. The final point under robust is basically making sure that ICT professionals write good code, so that one's pretty straightforward. So that's a bit of the WCAG 2 standard. That's the 12 overarching guidelines. And whilst it's always interesting to hear about the guidelines and talk through those issues, it's also really helpful to have a chance to look and see some best practice and perhaps not so good best practice on accessibility. So what I've done here, and I'm just on to the next slide now around good design examples, I've created a few examples of good design and a few of bad design. And it really is helpful. In this webinar context, it can be a bit tricky to show you live examples, but I've got a few screenshots here, and I'd encourage you to follow up on some of these if you want to have a look. Just to read out the URLs I'm going to be looking at, under good design. I'd like to think we practice what we preach at Media Access Australia, so I have mediaaccess.org.au, which is our website. I also have the BBC's website, bbc.co.uk, and I also have the Intellectual Property Australia site, a government site, which is ipaustralia.gov.au. I've just switched to the slide showing the Media Access Australia website to briefly describe what's here and why we've endeavoured to make this best practice. The site has good contrast levels. The site is quite clearly laid out. There's some good navigation, very clear navigation structure towards the top of the page. We also have for screen reader users things like a skip to content link to avoid some of the more repetitive content of menus, depending if you spend time on our site. And whilst I can't show you the live example, this screenshot does indicate that it's quite a clear, consistent navigation layout. It works quite well with screen readers. Our videos are captioned, and we've endeavoured to have a good experience with the MAA website. Moving on to the next slide with the BBC website, and it's interesting that one of the common things we get told all the time is, oh look, we'd love to do accessibility, but we have to make our site boring and not very media friendly, so accessibility is a really hard thing. But the reality is that the BBC is a very good example of an accessible website, and it's arguably one of the most content-rich websites in the world. And the reason being that the site has lots of audio described and captioned video content through its iPlayer. It also has lots of children's games, so there's lots of games for the kids, and that's designed all to be keyboard friendly and accessible. The content of this site is very well laid out. The news items are very clear. It's very obvious where you are on the site. The colour contrast is good. The navigation structure is good. And ultimately, a great website example. The final good example is looking at the IP Australia website, and this is a good case study of the government's national transition strategy when the government had to transform its websites to become WCAG 2 compliant. This is one of the best examples of that process being successful. This site is focused on patents, so there's a lot of very technical, very in-depth information around registering patents and things like that on this site. And the original site was a mess in terms of trying to find things. So the IT manager made the decision to do everything possible to make sure that the website was accessible. And she worked very hard to make the navigation really simple. And on this screenshot here, you'll see that there's really, really simple navigation. And the site is just a beautiful site to use, a good contrast, easy options, and for a site that is very heavy in technical information, they've done a great job in making it accessible. Now look, it's only fair after sharing some good examples that I also share some bad ones. And so I'm now onto the slide called Bad Design Examples, and the three sites I'm going to flick through here are Mr. Bottles, which is a US shop that sells antique bottles called mrbottles.com, mrbottles.com. And I apologise for nightmares you'll have after going to that one later. I'm going to select something from my home state of Western Australia. Now I can use this one because I've been promised that this site will be gone soon with an accessible equivalent. So I'm choosing the city of Fremantle, which is fremantle.wa.gov.au. And I'm also looking at Yahoo 7, yahoo7.com.au. So I've just changed to the screenshot of Mr. Bottles. Now, you can't fully appreciate the horror of this website as a screenshot. So I would encourage you after the webinar to go to mrbottles.com to experience what I can only say is something memorable. I can't think of an accessibility rule this site doesn't break. So the colours are appalling. Screen reader users, you will have immense difficulty after I think it reads out about 4 words and then gets stuck. The colours are atrocious. There's virtually no navigation structure. When you first go to this site, a little man will pop up and start talking to you, and on some browsers you can't actually stop him. So that's an interesting thing in itself. And if you scroll down this page, it will go on for an eternity. So if you want a worst case example, it's this one. And look, I've got to be honest with you, I'm a little bit torn about this site. Because on one hand, I hope for a day that sites like this don't exist on the net. But the other half of me goes, well, it's really good to have an example that I can show people about what the issues are. And I also suspect that the owners of this site must be quite happy because of presentations like this, they get hits all the time. So they're probably quite pleased that their site is the way it is. I've just moved to the City of Fremantle screenshot, and the City of Fremantle website, the reason why this is a particularly difficult site is because it really comes down to what would you use a local government site for. And looking at the education context, the question a lot of people need to ask is, why do we have our website? So be it a tertiary institution or in this case local government, you just need to think about what the main reasons are that people would be coming to a site. And we did a bit of a poll in our office about why would you come to a local government website. And the things we came up with were, you'd probably want to know when your bins are being collected, you'd probably want to know the opening hours of a library, you'd want to know how to pay your fines, maybe register your pet, things along those lines, and maybe some local events in the area. Well, what this website has done is they've basically focused on events, and they've plastered events all over the place. But if you wanted to actually find out when your bins are getting collected, if you want to find out the opening hours of a library, or anything else that most people would come to a local government for, you'd be very hard-pressed to do that on this site. So this is a really good example of what happens when perhaps the reason for a site's existence gets overshadowed by trying to make it glitzy and funky. And the reality is that the Fremantle website is very hard to use, and I was very delighted to hear that this site stays unnumbered. Now, the last example of bad sites, Yahoo 7, is something that people often say, well, you know, Yahoo 7 is a very popular site. Why would that be a bad example? And look, when you first look at it, it doesn't look too bad. There's lots of news items, there's lots of images. It doesn't look that different to the BBC one. So why then is it such a bad example? The problem is clutter. And what Yahoo 7 have tried to do is they've assumed that everything you could possibly want to get hold of on this website will put on the homepage somewhere. And as a result, whilst everything you want probably is on the homepage somewhere, it's very hard to actually find the specific thing you're looking for. Now, I could have easily used interchange this with 9MSN or some of the other websites out there, so it's not a particularly that I'm being mean on Yahoo 7, but it is an example of where, again, the focus of a site, what does this site stand for, what are people trying to find, and when you think about something like Google, which basically has a very clean page to help you get where you need to go, as this site takes the opposite approach to try and barrage you with ads and lots of other things, it does make it tricky for accessibility. And I mention this as an example because it's worth reflecting on your various tertiary institutions websites and where some of those, you know, how effective is the site in guiding people to the information that they're likely to want, or do they try to put it all on the homepage? Just some food for thought. So moving on to documents, and I'd just like to touch on a few other roles to wrap up outside of general ICT. And one of the things that we often get asked is, okay, well, WCAG seems to be this big, complex ICT thing. What about other roles? What about documents? What about our marketing and comms people? Well, with documents, I mean, all of us write documents. It's important that they're accessible too. And what's a nice tip is that built into Office 2010 and 2013, there is a built-in document accessibility checker. So if you do use styles and you try and make your documents quite good to start with, you can then run that accessibility checker that's built into Office, and it will then report to you if there are accessibility issues and how to tweak things to make it better. We often get asked about PDFs as well. How accessible are PDFs? The answer today is that PDFs can be made quite accessible. They're still quite challenging if they're scanned or in other formats like that. But the key is to make your source document as accessible as possible, and then the PDF you create should turn out not too bad. So using a Word example, make sure you run that accessibility checker in Word, and then when you make that PDF, it should turn out all right. Onto the slide, social media. And we often get asked a lot about how accessible social media is. The answer is that in the past 18 months, it's improved a lot. Facebook and Twitter both now have dedicated accessibility teams, which is really encouraging. Facebook even has an assistive technology help desk. We have alternative portals for Twitter like EasyChirp, which is quite an accessible alternative. And as I was saying before, it's great that YouTube has caption support, both in terms of its automated captions and also the ability to edit those captions afterwards. So social media has improved a lot in a very short space of time. So for lecturers and other, trying to communicate messages from the university or a tertiary institution over social media is quite a viable option now for people with disabilities. Now, the very last thing I wanted to cover today is probably the biggest thing we get asked by staff in the education sector, and it is, what do we do if a student complains about accessibility? How do we handle that? What's the best strategy to provide support to that student? Well, one of the really big key messages, and I think that's probably come through loud and clear today, is make sure that the ICT professionals in a tertiary institution are striving to meet WCAG 2 level AA compliance. That is the international standard, that is the definitive standard, that is the start and the end of the conversation in many ways, be it websites, apps, or documents. Make it WCAG 2 compliance, and that will resolve many, many, many accessibility issues. But even if that is implemented, it is quite possible that students will still have some issues. The issues will be much easier to address if WCAG 2 has been implemented, but there might be some particular quirks with particular assistive technologies. If that's the case, the next thing is, how easy is it for a student to make complaints? You'd probably like to think the student would immediately come to you. What we've found from the conversations we've had is students will often try calling the switch of an organisation, or they might even try and send an email to maybe the webmaster or something like that. So what we've found is an interesting experiment is, what happens if you do call the switch of your organisation and complain about accessibility issues? Where does that call go? Do you know? What happens if you send an email? Does it end up at some webmaster's email address it's never checked? It's worth just investigating how easy it is for a complaint or a concern about accessibility to actually reach where it needs to go, because it's often been the case that students have been frustrated that the call hasn't ended up in a place that where it can be of assistance. And this is often a process issue rather than not having that support, as I'm sure many of you do a wonderful job in providing that support, but it's important that that concern reaches you. Also, just make sure the students kept well informed of the issue, and this again is training ICT staff to make sure that they are well informed about that, and that there is some notable progress towards resolving the issue. So just briefly to explain a few of the services that Media Access Australia provides, we run a 6-week online course that I co-teach called the Professional Certificate in Web Accessibility. It's run in partnership with the University of South Australia, so it's an accredited course, and that trains ICT professionals on how to incorporate accessibility into their work processes. So if anyone would like some information on that, mediaaccess.org.au/learn, or you're very welcome to get in touch with me. And also on the slide around needing help, we do offer a range of accessibility services. We can provide a free initial accessibility assessment of your organisations, and my colleague Jeff White, based in Sydney, he can assist with that, or by all means get in touch with me and I can put you in touch. So that's pretty much it for me. I'm just on the slide further information. If anyone would like to get in touch, I'd be more than happy to answer any other questions you may have after today. My email address is scott.hollier@mediaaccess.org.au. My telephone number, direct line in Perth, is 0893118230, or if you're based in New South Wales, you can call 92126242 and they'll put you through. Our website has a raft of fairly comprehensive information around all the things talked about today, mediaaccess.org.au, and you're also very welcome to follow us on Twitter @mediaaccessaus. Again, I'd just like to say a very big thank you to the organisers today, Darlene and Jane. It's been a privilege to share this information with you, and I'm very happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. That was wonderful. We had a bit of a glitch at the beginning of the webinar. I think some people dropped out and came back in, so I do apologise for that. It's all Scott's fault because he was talking about how easy the GoToWebinar was, and I thought he would jinx us.
It seems like good in rehearsal.
It did. It all goes well. My heart's kind of nearly started beating okay again. So we've got a couple of questions that I will ask you. So one of the questions asked by one of the practitioners is any suggestion for good captioning options for universities that can be used for academics when developing their unit content? YouTube captioning can be really bad, and some captioning options are prohibitively expensive. Have you had much experience?
Yeah, it's a great question. And as I was saying during the presentation, we do acknowledge that the automated caption process it's helpful for getting the timing right, but the accuracy can vary wildly and they'll still need to be tweaked. There are some good caption editors, and the caption editor in YouTube isn't too bad, but probably the best one around if you're looking for a free, very professional captioning editing software and fairly easy to use is called Amara, A-M-A-R-A, and I think the website's amara.org. And Amara's captioning suite, it's free. You can basically point it to the video that you want to caption, and then you can save those captions and say upload them to YouTube once you're done. Or you can take the YouTube, or another option is you can get the captions done automatically from YouTube to get the timing right. Then save those captions, upload them to Amara, and then edit them. Amara is something that we found to be quite popular, and it's a very professional captioning suite, and it's free. So that would be certainly one recommendation, and I certainly do take the point that the automated captions are saying if you have no background noise, a slight American accent, they can be all right, but for the rest of us, they can be a bit dicey.
Thank you. Is there a tool that checks website accessibility in the same way as a Word document?
There is. There's a few good free tools out there, and the names of those are Tor, T-A-W, A-Checker, and also Wave, W-A-V-E is a very popular one by WebAIM. And if you search for any of those words plus the word accessibility in Google, it should be the first hit that comes up. In terms of commercial products, the one I personally like to use is called SortSite, S-O-R-T-S-I-T-E. It's made by a company called PowerMapper. It retails at around the $200 mark, and that's quite good. Now, I do put a little asterisk and disclaimer on these tools. The tools are very good in giving you a heads up as to how accessible websites are. And SortSite, I'd say, is probably the better of the ones mentioned. But that said, the automated tools can only check about half of the accessibility issues. So things like if a video is captioned or not, it won't pick that up. The other thing to be aware of with these tools is that if it finds one little accessibility issue, you'll get all sorts of red crosses on the screen saying, inaccessible, inaccessible. And so the site may not always be as bad as these tools report. But that said, I do like these tools because they do give you a basic heads up. If you don't get many errors from the tool, then it probably means your site's not too bad. If you get pages and pages of errors, then it means that the site does have some pretty significant problems. So it's good to use the tool as a guide, and SortSite would be my preference, but Tor, A-Checker, and Wave are three good free ones if you just want to have a go.
Excellent. Do you also have any recommendations for using citation software, e.g. EndNote app?
Yeah, it's a very good question. EndNote is probably still the best of the citation software out there in terms of accessibility, but there are accessibility challenges. So I don't have any silver bullets for that one, unfortunately. I know EndNote has improved a lot over the years, and the fact that things like Word have improved a lot with accessibility as well means the two work together a lot better than they used to. But no, to be honest, that EndNote is probably still the best option, and but yes, there are some accessibility issues, unfortunately.
Yep, thank you. What is the acceptable level of accuracy for captioning?
Well, that's a very, very good question, because it's caption quality is something that is being looked at a lot, and it really depends on the forum. So when we look at things like the ACMA on television, the rates, I can't remember the exact percentage offhand, but I know it's I think it's somewhere around 98%. It could be slightly more or less, but I think by memory it's around that 98% figure. Online, there is no specifically stated caption quality, so yeah, there's quality things around broadcast, but not online. So ultimately, I mean, our view is that the better you can do captions, the more it helps. I was having a discussion with someone at a tertiary institution the other day who had some software that will automatically caption a lecture, and the software doesn't do a great job at captioning a lecture. And so the question was, should we put those inaccurate captions online, or should we have no captions at all? And it was a really tough question, but I would tend to lean towards having the captions online with a disclaimer message saying the accuracy of these captions is not 100%. It's not, as it could be, but I sort of come from the point of view that some access is better than no access. And look, if you could also put something to say these captions, can be fixed up on request or something like that. So that would then make it manageable for staff trying to fix up those captions. It also means that ultimately the user will get a good quality captions, but at least there's some sort of starting point. So I think the thing with accessibility is that there is room for compromise. I think we should always strive for best practice, but that's the caption quality question is a good one because yes, there is certainly a need for quality, but if it comes down to a choice between poor quality or none at all, I'd tend to lean towards providing some captions, but again, making sure there's options to get those captions better.
Excellent. And just someone's asked, have you had any experience with Turnitin?
I haven't used Turnitin much myself, so no, I can't speak to that. I'm sorry. I have spoken to other people who have said that Turnitin is does work quite well. So I have another academic who has a disability that I'm friends with, and he was saying that it is quite accessible in terms of checking for plagiarism and things like that. But I haven't had any personal experience with that. No, I'm sorry.
That's great. So we've had some positive feedback, Scott. Just one question I had, which I asked you at the beginning, but maybe someone's as challenged about writing things on the web as I am. But you said it's not good to use click here when you're actually wanting to get redirect somebody on a website. So what do you suggest people use instead of click here?
Well, I think one of the best things to do is just consider in the context of what has been written as to where you can put the link to make it a bit more descriptive. So before the webinar started, the example I was giving is that let's say you have a paragraph that has something like click here to find more information from the CNET news item on the Apple Watch. Well, rather than having click here as your link, you could have CNET news item on Apple Watch as your link. And then a screen reader who's jumping from link to link, instead of landing on a link and it's just saying click here and not understanding what the context is, it would land and say CNET news item for Apple Watch, and then that would make a lot more sense. So I think often it's not really much more work, but it is often about changing work practices to go, okay, well, rather than making the click here or the read more the link, I'll just look a little bit further along the paragraph or before and make the more descriptive bit the link. So it's more a technique rather than it's something that can be particularly onerous. But very important to make sure those links are descriptive, and that is part of the techniques within the requirement for WCAG 2 AA. So very important to do it.
Excellent. All right, well, we've come to the end of the webinar. This recording will be online. One of the other questions we've got, Scott, is it okay to share your PowerPoint presentation?
Oh, by all means. Look, and as I was saying before, if anyone has any questions or wants to get in touch and ask anything at all, you're more than welcome to do so. And yes, please, by all means, spread the slides around.
Yep, that's brilliant. All right, so I'll go and start to write the referee's report to try to get your boss to give you the gold Apple Watch, because you've done such a great job today. I look forward to that. And I'm an Apple girl, but you've kind of tantalised me with the lollipop and the marshmallow word for the Android, so maybe I'll have to start looking at an Android device. So we hope to get this presentation up on AdSet within the next week. And we have had some challenges with some people accessing the captioning today. If they've stayed with us, I do apologise for that, and we'll work with you after this to see what's gone wrong. And I want to thank everybody for their time. Thank you to Bradley Reporting for their support. Thank you for Scott for his time, and for Jane in the back end, and for all of you giving your time. We have another webinar coming to us in June, which will be around a new resource that will be launched around helpful hints for students on the autism spectrum accessing further education. So that will come out in our next newsletter. So thank you, everybody, and we'll close the webinar now, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you, and thanks, Scott.
No worries at all. Thanks very much.